Chapter 13 Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Read by Dan McLaughlin. Apology to Eliza. If he were the judge in the Apology Olympics, Brian was ready to give himself high marks. 2 apologies had been given and received quite well, he thought, and that qualified as a winning streak. There was just the 3rd apology left, and he would be 3 for 3. And who was number 3? Eliza something or the other. Spencer? He didn't think it mattered if he remembered her name. Brian was on a roll. Honesty plus charm equaled success with the ladies. He wasn't going to spoil his mood worrying about what Alice might think. Brian had a clear sense of mental labor here. Alice, brains, figure stuff out, play by the rules. Brian, charm, wing it, and look good. Ladies, be amazed by the onslaught of charm and honesty. Thus far, this time travel was proving to be a breeze. Brian thought about the lady who liked flowers. Number 3 part of Brian's brain helpfully supplied. He remembered distinctly the way she had been particularly discomforted when he addressed her with his impromptu version of, "You must pay the rent." Of all the 3 ladies he had insulted, he felt the worst about how he had treated her. She was clearly sensitive, maybe even shy, and in retrospect, it felt like he had been mean to a kitten. Here was a nice, quiet girl who liked flowers, and Brian recognized that he had filled her eyes with terror and disgust. He definitely owed her this apology. But no worries. Now that he had the formula down, she would soon find him charming too. All he had to do was find her. This turned out to be easier said than done. She wasn't in the blue sitting room or in the green sitting room. She wasn't in the yellow parlor or the portrait hall. After a fruitless search in a number of rooms in the sprawling castle, he finally happened to glance out the window and found the flower-loving girl, Eliza Spencer, sitting in one of the formal gardens, sketching a part of the view with pastels. His heart leapt. She was outside, which meant it was socially permissible to wear his amazing greatcoat again. He hightailed it up the stairs to make the necessary wardrobe changes and managed to dress himself without the help of a valet in under 5 minutes. He reached the door leading out to the garden a little out of breath, but feeling confident. Brian had his lace-edged sleeves and his fancy coat, and while he recognized an impulse to make his usual grand entrance, with unusual circumspection, he allowed this urge to die unexpressed. Instead, with the image of a shy kitten foremost in his consciousness, he approached the young lady cautiously, and in a polite and quiet voice began speaking. "I'm sorry. I can see that you are busy. This is quite a lovely drawing, but might I have a word with you, Miss Spencer?" He could almost see it happen, as a lifetime of deference slipped into place. "Of course, Lord Latimer," the lady said. She set down her pastels, clearly bracing herself for this conversation, but she also slid a blank piece of paper over the art, hiding her work. She did it deftly, clearly hoping he would not notice. But he did notice, and being himself, Brian had to remark on it. "I know artists don't like to show their work before it's done, but I hope you will share your sketch when it's completed," he said in what he hoped was a friendly way. "As you wish, Lord Latimer." Her tone was flat. Miss Spencer had folded her pastel-smudged fingers together on her apron in her lap and regarded them in apparent fascination. "Please," he smiled, "Lord Latimer is my father. Call me Brian." He exuded confidence. In all the movies he had seen, this line had always worked. Unfortunately, movies had yet to be invented. "If you will excuse me, my lord." She made a motion with her hands, one that somehow suggested she intended to resume drawing, while at the same time implying that this activity was not to take place so long as Lord Latimer's overconfident son was anywhere in the vicinity. While he was impressed by the economical gesture, Brian had come out to the garden specifically to have his apology accepted. No matter what Miss Spencer preferred, he was determined to plow ahead. "What a pleasantly sunny day it is," he said in an attempt to start a harmless conversation. The weather is always a safe topic, he thought. Miss Spencer said nothing. "She's just shy," Brian thought. "I mean, you would think all that bright sunshine would be too warm for comfort," Brian continued. You would think all that bright sunshine would be too warm for comfort," Brian continued. "But the warmth of the sun, I find, is contrasted by the coolness of the sea breeze. You know," he said, "both of these elements seem to be in perfect balance today. Yes, it is a fine, fine day." Miss Spencer made no reply, except to pull the little jacket she wore a bit more snugly around her shoulders to protect her from that same cool sea breeze. "She's just really shy," thought Brian. "She just needs a few more words from me." "And this is winter," he went on, "when they say that temperatures are often far from ideal. But it isn't snowing now, or even raining. It's sunny. Now I've observed that on some occasions that the sun could be too hot, or the breeze too cool, in which case there would not be an ideal balance. But since the elements of warmth and coolth here are in balance, here in the garden, there's a degree of comfort I did not expect to find, especially given the time of year." Miss Spencer, perhaps because she was absorbed, wiping pastel smudges from her fingers, did not offer a counter-observation. Brian felt a growing desire to provoke any response from her. "I wonder whether you have had the opportunity to notice the picturesque location of the castle, offering, as it does, such a wonderful view of both land and sea." "Well, of course you have," he added, ratcheting his smile up a notch in the friendly scale, and wishing that the valet hadn't wrapped his fantastic 19th century cravat quite so stiflingly tight around his throat earlier that morning. "It has inspired you to artistic greatness. I assume that'll be great once I see it. That is, yes, this location," he opined, "to perfectly catch the warmth of the sun radiated off the land and the coolness of the breeze from the sea." Miss Spencer remained remotely focused on her folded hands, and an uncomfortable pause followed the glowing tribute to the local topography. She seemed not in the least inclined to rescue him as he continued to discuss the merits of sunshine versus breeze, and indeed seemed quite content to remain silent, although at one point she turned her attention from her folded hands to Brian's face, but as she merely stared at him with blunt, forced patience, that wasn't as helpful as it could have been. Brian finally wound down. He had simply run out of words without even once having said anything useful, helpful, or indeed interesting. Only at this point did Miss Spencer relent. Climate is affected by local geography, yes, Lord Latimer. Her tone was neutral, but at least it proved that she had been paying attention to the most coherent thread of his attempted conversation. Good, good. Eager to see her remark as a sign that his charm had worked, Brian just went straight to the next part before Eliza could return to her silence. "Here's the thing, Eliza," he began. "Miss Spencer," she corrected him with that awful, painful politeness. Brian ignored her, plunged on. "You see, my sister and I, we're from the future." Brian paused for her reaction. The responses given him by the first two ladies offered him hope that this revelation might reach past Eliza's defenses. But it did not seem to be the case. Miss Spencer's face remained impassive. Calm was not a good sign, Brian reflected. He fidgeted, awaiting her reaction with increasing nervousness. She seemed, at least, to be turning over his words in her head. Then her face cleared as she made some kind of decision. In a matter-of-fact way, she asked, "Who will be the next king?" What? Brian was confused. "If you are from the future, Lord Latimer, tell me who will be England's next king?" She repeated the question quite distinctly. Brian racked his brain, trying to remember what little he knew of 19th century British monarchs. Eliza simply waited, resembling nothing so much as a teacher waiting for an ill-prepared student to finish his recitation. There was still something kitten-like about her expression, but Brian was suddenly reminded that even kittens have claws. Miss Spencer's calm stare was torture. Clearly, she was willing to let him flounder, waiting to hear the right answer, and had no idea what that might be. Brian knew he had to say something. "George?" Brian guessed in a hopeful tone. He knew there were lots of Georges in there, so if he was going to guess, it likely could be. "Since that is the name of our current king, I suppose that could be the correct answer," Eliza conceded. "Let's try something closer to your supposed home, the colonies." The sense that he was a failing student was even stronger now. Brian definitely hadn't come out here to face a pop quiz. He didn't dare look at his pocket watch, but had a distinct sense that he had still 40 minutes until the class was over. It was a feeling that he had last felt in Spanish 1A many years ago and thought he had forgotten. "Tell me then, who is going to be the next president of your United States? Or even, who is the president now?" Miss Spencer continued without any variation in her tone. Brian began to count on his fingers. "Let me see. I think I should know this one, right?" Brian began to count on his fingers. "Washington, that's 2 terms. 1789 plus 8 equals 1797. Adams, he had just 1. Jefferson, he had 2. It's 1810, right?" Brian paused mentally as he did the math. Miss Spencer waited. "So it's either Jefferson or Madison." "It's Madison. I know it. Madison, 1812, Mr. Madison's War. That's it. There's going to be a war in 1812 between our two countries." Brian beamed as he thought he had aced the test. Unfortunately, His intended audience seemed less than impressed with the recitation, but she had the good manners to continue the game, even though the outcome, to her, was becoming clear. Another war with the United States? It's the War of 1812, Brian said promptly, eager to add supporting detail. Miss Spencer's gaze was excruciatingly polite. The War of 1812, she repeated. Well, it takes place in 1812, see, and, he said, his voice trailing away as he realized how uncertain he sounded. He decided to double down. Facts probably were on his side. Well, it ends in 1814, after you guys burned Washington. He said, the capital, not the man. The town, not the dead president, she asked as if to clarify an important distinction. Desperately, he said, yes, no, I can really prove it. Francis Scott Key was on a boat and he wrote about it. It's going to be the national anthem. Brian began to sing, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed? That's a drinking song, my lord. Eliza was beginning to sound a little annoyed as Brian was clearly slipping into demon theater mode again. Yeah, I know, but Francis Scott Key in American. Brian was having some idea of what a twilight felt before its last gleaming. Still convinced he could talk his way through this, he continued. Then the war ended in 1814. The Battle of New Orleans. We won. Brian knew that he should stop, but somehow just couldn't. Some horrified, angst-ridden part of his brain knew that this was going poorly, but also insisted that he was right. He could convince her. He just needed to find the right words. Which took place where? Miss Spencer was not smiling, but had the air of someone determined to play out the hand even though the outcome was long since predetermined. If he was going to persist in playing, she was certainly not going to stop him, even to spare the shreds of his dignity. New Orleans. Brian felt another song rise to the surface of his consciousness. He knew that if he sang it, he just was going to look even more like an idiot, but he couldn't seem to stop himself from singing. They ran through the briars, and they ran through the brambles, and they ran through the bushes where the rabbits couldn't go. Clearly, Lenora had heard enough. She turned her face away and swiftly began to gather her materials. I see, she said, rabbits. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them, on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Brian concluded because some songs, once started, had to be completed. Eliza rose to her feet, wrapping her pastels and pages together compactly. So, in summary, she stated, there is to be a war in 1812 called the War of 1812, during which Washington, the city, not the person, will be burned. That event will be celebrated in America by a drinking song. It will become the national anthem, Brian said softly. Miss Spencer stared stonily at the interruption. If I may continue, she said. Brian was remembering silent, kitten-like Eliza Spencer with fondness. A drinking song becomes the national anthem. Then, the War of 1812 concludes near a town called New Orleans with a battle called the Battle of New Orleans. And this is the evidence that you have time-traveled, Lord Latimer? Eliza Spencer was no kitten. She was a tiger. Brian could only nod. The Battle of New Orleans is remembered in history because Britain is defeated by rabbits. Is that it, Lord Latimer? Well, not quite, began Brian. The rabbits are... Eliza shook her head. The conversation was clearly over. Thank you very much, Lord Latimer, for that very entertaining future history and geography lesson. I think the warmth of the sun and the coolness of the breeze are getting a bit too much for me at present. Her tone remained perfectly polite, but Brian was in no doubt that it was the castle's lord and not its weather that had been too much for Miss Spencer. I should get inside. Allow me. Brian made a motion like he was going to help her gather her things and was rebuffed, politely but firmly. No need to accompany me, Eliza quickly interposed. I shall do quite well on my own. She left, and he belatedly realized he still hadn't been permitted to see the picture she had been making. In the embarrassing silence left in her wake, Brian wondered how that might have gone better. He realized that he'd never gotten to the part of the conversation where he meant to have apologized. Somehow, they'd skipped past it. At least he confessed the time travel bit. That part was important, he thought, but had he managed the trivia quiz well enough? He mentally reviewed the list of presidents through Lincoln to dispel any doubt that he might have been wrong. Wait, Monroe. That was the one after Madison, he thought. The next president. Madison. Monroe. Adams, the other one. Maybe he should have mentioned Monroe. And the apology, of course. But other than that, he had gotten everything right, basically. Buoyed by his knowledge of American history and convinced that he had answered most of the questions correctly, Brian persuaded himself that he could report to Alice that Eliza was more or less a maybe at this point. Not as rousing a success as the first two, but not a failure. Probably. After all, she had said the conversation had been entertaining there at the end, so maybe she was a maybe plus even. End of chapter 13 of Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, read by Dan McLaughlin, 2024.